Hi everybody, this is Hero back with another Dragonflight video. In this video I'd like to talk about Arms Warrior and Mythic Plus, and specifically I want to show you from the perspective of failed builds how we can think about the talent spectrum between full AoE with Blade Storms, Whirlwinds, Storm of Swords stuff, Bone Grinder, and more single target where we're doing execute damage and fatality and maybe draining off bleeds. I tried a lot of builds in Mythic Plus, and if you want pure AoE damage, you must go for big Blade Storms and the Avatar Blade Storms and Storm of Swords and Cleave. It is awesome. But I wanted to showcase in this video three distinct builds that are trying to move the bar slightly away from AoE toward single target. And I do it in a number of ways. You can see here in the first video, I was trying to do some kind of a Shockwave setup, i.e. lean on a short roar and try to make use of Shockwave for both the utility side and damage, and see if I can use those CDs to manage to do reasonable damage while having an execute single target focus. So we're sweeping executes with fatality and juggernaut, that kind of stuff. It turns out, guys, to be quite bad. And I wanted to make the video in part to show you why it's bad. So you can see in that first pull we did almost no damage because we're missing out on Colossus Smash damage, amplifying our bleeds. Our Cleave and Whirlwind are not there to carry us. Here we're getting somewhere like 70k, but this is a pull that we're used to seeing about 150 to 200k damage for a lot of pulls. And although Shockwave offered us quite a lot of utility, it's a good 25-second stun. Its contribution on the damage side, as you might expect, isn't that great. But it's good to test it for yourself and to see what is it that went wrong. Even on a boss like this where people have died so the ads aren't dying very quickly and you have therefore more targets to hit, you'll notice here when I check on the damage that Shockwave's contribution in this situation is quite low. You'll see here I'm at something like 7 or 8% in a fight with so many targets for it to hit. And I bring this up at the beginning of the video because there's going to be a range or spectrum of ideas that you can pursue as an Arms Warrior in Mythic Plus that either leans more towards big AoE damage, maybe in Fortified, or more towards priority damage. And you have to figure out what pieces are good and what are bad. Let's start by saying, here are the definitively poor options. Don't, as an Arms Warrior, try to make Shockwave work. And I don't mean like don't ever make this work, but understand what you're doing. You are severely impeding your AoE damage profile because you're missing out on big Blade Storms through Avatar or a bunch of rage generation through Avatar. You're missing the damage amp from Avatar, many things. But I wanted to show you firsthand. I tested this a number of times. I could not make a Shockwave build that I liked. The scuffed version, which is Shockwave plus Blade Storm, misses out on essentially the Avatar side because Dragon's Roar is so strong. You might be able to pick up Shockwave as a 1 point, forgetting about the bottom tier portions, but for Arms, I found it to be very lackluster. The second build I spent time testing out. This is again moving away from the premium Mythic Plus AoE damage build and trying to bring it down to a more single target approach that might help us for priority damage. This build was an execute focused build. So I'm trying my best to get fatality with Cleave, to get 1 minute roars down that do a lot of bleed damage, and then I'm supporting the build by sweeping big executes. So I'm trying to get fatality to proc on mobs and on bosses, so I still have some damage. I'm trying to get big execute damage while still retaining some ability to put up bleeds like deep wounds. And what this build showed me after I did a lot of testing with it is that Cleave is 100% essential for Arms Warrior in Mythic Plus. I don't think you have to take the full cleave package, i.e. the reduced cleave. But without cleave, you will not get good damage in Mythic Plus. That's because you will burst with, say, your Warbreaker in AoE and do okay for half of a pull. But there's no way to reliably apply our mastery, Deep Wounds, unless you're going to sweep Mortal Strikes. So you have to wait for those 30 seconds or 20 seconds before Warbreaker comes back up. And by that time, you've moved on to new mobs. As you can see here, I've already used Warbreaker and I do not have a means outside of Cleave of applying the debuff as the tank pulls more stuff. So this run, of all the runs, even though I'm trying to really focus on single target damage through Fatality, made me realize that Cleave is a very essential part to the rotation from a Mythic Plus perspective. And that's cool. It's actually not necessarily because Cleave does tons of damage, though it has a pretty good damage profile as you see here. But it's partly because the bleeds are giving us lots of rage generation in AoE, and they do pretty good damage. So it was nice. It was nice to physically test this out in the game, and I'd encourage you to do the same thing. This made it for me that I have to slot at least 1 point for Cleave in any of my approaches. Now, most of the approaches are going to be big Blade Storms with short Cleave and Storm of Swords anyways, with, Bone Grinder being so good. But if you ever needed an incentive to think about where do I put my points if I want a mostly single target approach and not be completely destroyed on AoE, Cleave has to be part of the conversation. So this is, as I said, short Dragon's Roar, which I'm kind of on the fence about. It doesn't line up with Avatar because it's a 1 minute cooldown versus 1.5. You can see the desynchronization here means that we got Roar at the beginning, but everything else is out of whack. Even our Warbreaker is out of whack just due to how we finish those mobs. But the single target is still fairly reasonable. You can see Fatality here stacking up somewhere like, I think we're at 9 stacks or 10 stacks before we get to proc it. This is an 11, so it's pretty low key in general. But you'll see I'm kind of in the middle here, and I will immediately, when I'm at 12 stacks, when that goes off, I sort of bump up in damage. So Fatality for me was a pretty big source of damage, somewhere between 4 and 8%, I think, for bosses, and something like 5% overall. There we go, we've come back in. This other warrior, I'm really glad they were in the key because they were demonstrating the full AoE DPS, and I'll show you when we go to the Overgrowth boss for this build how much more effective Blade Storm, Whirlwind, Cleave focuses are for AoE, and why I would suggest to you, if you wanted to start somewhere with Mythic Plus, begin with that full AoE setup and do big pulls with your group and see if you can carry the damage that way, because it will be very effective. For those of you who want to pare it back down and get rid of some of those pieces to make room for AoE or single target priorities, you can start to take a look at this build as an example. But here, watch this. As we get through the Overgrowth, both of us are holding CDs. The ads start to come out. You'll see the Blade Storm from the other warrior in a second. My priority is to Colossus Smash, clap, Dragon's Roar, and then funnel the bleeds if I can into the damage on the boss. We're trying to press Cleave on CD here, although I will admit that in a number of these videos, I was not playing the best. My Cleave was being held for too long in a lot of circumstances. For most of Mythic Plus guys, you want to be pressing Cleave almost entirely on CD. As soon as there's 3 targets, it's such a valuable button. Not only that, I held my Dragon's Roar in a number of cases, and I think this might have also been one of the cases where I did, or our kill video for this boss, I can't quite remember. But my testing has shown that even if you're doing a little more of the single target stuff over on this side, Cleave is so strong. We want to be using it. So here I'm holding CDs a little bit. You'll see I'm holding Dragon's Roar. But even so, the power of the full AoE build is on display above me there with Cicel and that character's damage. So really good stuff. It's exciting actually to be able to see in practice that there is an AoE option for us as Arms Warrior, and that's exciting because there's going to be some really great Mythic Plus pulls. and I'm looking forward to trying them out. But for now, let's take a look at one other pull here that I think is instructive, and we'll see it when we go to the final build. This 4-pack on Algothars represents a really good midway between big giant pulls and what you might see in like things like Halls of Valor, where you have a lot of giant bodies that are tough that you cannot really pull in large groups, so you'll have to deal with them in something like 3 or 4. What this build is suggesting is we can still push like 100k damage with CDs using sweeping executes, which is going to be the main other option for you if you do not want to do big blade storms. So this build will perform, and fatality is a big part of that. Being able to spam executes because our bleeds are everywhere is a big part of that. Here's the final build. You can see there, I'm looking at a build that's trying to make use of Skull Splitter. So this was largely a single target approach, though its damage was fairly reasonable in AoE as well. But we have still cleave access here, which is significant for all of the non-boss portions. The only difference here is we have Avatar lining up with Dragon's Roar. We have access to the bleed synergies that we get out of Skull Splitter, and you'll see here I'm performing this target. This should be kind of a high single target build, and I'm hoping it's a little bit clunky, but I'm hoping it's something that we can move forward in the dungeons where you have low ad quantities or you're on a tyrannical boss. Tyrannical bosses, of course, are going to give us access to more fatality stacks overall, and it'll make draining our bleeds through Skull Splitter fairly reasonable. So the main goal here is opening with CDs, draining the bleeds with Skull Splitter, putting our bleeds back up and maintaining them, and then doing as much execute damage as we possibly can. This is a good test case for it because it's pure single target. We'll also see it on the final boss. I think I have a version of it. And you can see here before fatality procs, we're hovering around 37k damage, and then fatality is going to go off here, I think, with 10 or 11 stacks. No, yeah, we get to 11 stacks, and it should, again, get us back up into that range. Pretty reasonable overall. I was impressed by it, and though it is clunky, and I'll talk about what I mean by that in a second, it was a pretty good effort if you just need priority damage. Now, the clunkiness of this comes in the fights in between bosses. When do you Skull Splitter? What's the appropriate time? How much time should be devoted to it versus just doing cleave, clap, that kind of stuff? It's always hard to say. And you can see on the 4-pack here, I don't get, even though I'm holding CDs, I don't really get an effective purchase on damage because I cleave and sweep off 2 of the bleeds, and then I have to reapply them. But half of the mobs in that pack won't be touched because they already still have the bleed from Rend and deep wounds on them, so you didn't really cleave it off. Sweeping strikes was only sort of marginally effective. So my takeaway from this is that Skull Splitter in general, in Mythic Plus, is largely not a good button to press. Great on the bosses, maybe it's okay in Tyrannical on some keys, but it's a lot of work to maintain, and it doesn't have a lot of payoff in between the bosses. But just so that you can see it, here's an example at the end of how you can make use of this if you want to. You can see I have about 3 seconds left on Skull Splitter. It's coming back up. Make sure I have my bleeds up, and then fire it off to drain off the boss. We are at about 7 stacks of 8 stacks of fatality, and I'm gonna rip fatality off in a second. We're at about 37k, and then bang, back up again around 40k. So you can reasonably expect in whatever this gear level is at 10 or 11 to do something like 35 to 40k single target damage with a lot of priority executes with this sort of a build. But again, I'm doing this video to show you what sorts of pieces are probably not going to be that good in Mythic Plus, to actually demonstrate it for you. That cleave is such a high priority button to have access to in the dungeons, and things like Skull Splitter are probably just a little Here we're getting a little bit more of the damage profile, so you can see execute is still going to be quite strong, and you can funnel your bleed resources to do a lot of sweeping executes. But even if you do that, you're probably going to be missing out if you do not have access to Bladestorm or the Avatar Bladestorm. Most of the pulls that you're going to see in Mythic Plus are going to lean a little bit more towards that side of things. So here's just a test for you to see which pieces really didn't work as well as we'd like them to. Maybe if they get tuned, they'll be a bit better. So if Skull Splitter amplifies bleed damage or something, there might be a space for it. But I wanted to showcase it for you guys so that you can see for yourself which pieces maybe to stay away from and what to test. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thanks for watching. We will catch you guys next time.